Now, it doesn't seem like that this Israel-Iran war is going to end very soon. And this is really bad news for the entire world, but for India especially. Now, I know there are many fanboys in India, okay? Fanboys of Israel, fanboys of Iran. And both of them want their side to win. But let me tell you, if this conflict prolongs, I don't know whether Israel would win or Iran would win, but definitely India would lose, at least economically. Recently, USA dropped the most dangerous non-nuclear weapons, bunker buster bombs on Iran, at least 3 nuclear sites of Iran. And this has basically provoked Iran a lot. Iran has given out some very serious threats. And one such threat is that Iran has warned USA and Israel that if this conflict prolongs, it is thinking about closing Strait of Hormuz. Now, if Iran closes Strait of Hormuz, this would be really bad news for India. Why? Because a lot of India's crude oil comes from this narrow water passage called Strait of Hormuz. Most of India's natural gas shipments come from this narrow passage of Strait of Hormuz. If Iran decides to block the Strait of Hormuz, it would have really serious impact on India's economy, because India's economy is dependent on crude oil and natural gas. Now, the thing is, this part is established that India will be hurt or India will be impacted economically if this conflict prolongs. But most people are focusing only on crude oil or natural gas. Most people are saying that the economic impact on India would be around crude oil prices, around India's import bill, around inflation. But very few people are talking about this war's impact on India's agriculture. If this conflict prolongs, it can destroy India's agriculture. It can really have serious economic repercussions for India's agriculture. Now, how will this conflict impact India's agriculture? How is India's agriculture related to Israel-Iran war? Let's talk about that. Now, to understand the impact of this war on India's agriculture, you need to understand a few facts about India's agriculture. Okay, how does India's agriculture work? Or how does any agriculture work? Look, for agriculture to work, you need good quality soils. And why do plants require soil? Well, soils provide them with nutrients, right? Now, not all soils are rich in nutrients what the plants require, okay? Not all soils have all the nutrients that are required by plants. That is why we depend on chemical fertilizers. Now, there are 3 types of nutrients that are very important for plants and food crops. These are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash, collectively known as NPK. Now, most soils are deficient in NPK. Either some soils are rich in nitrogen, but they would be deficient in potash. Some soils would be rich in phosphorus, but deficient in nitrogen, okay? That is why all food systems of the world, all farmers of the world, generally rely on chemical fertilizers, because these chemical fertilizers provide nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Different fertilizers provide different nutrients. Now, I know what you guys must be thinking. Why is nitrogen necessary for plant growth? Why is phosphorus necessary for plant growth? Why is potash necessary for plant growth? So let me explain this in a few lines, okay? Nitrogen is important for plant growth because nitrogen is important for photosynthesis and growth of leaves of plants. Phosphorus is important for roots and flowering of plant. And potash is important for plants to provide them with drought resistance when there is not much water available, right? So all these 3 nutrients are of essentiality, or they are essential for plant growth. And that is why farmers all over the world rely on chemical fertilizers to get these nutrients to their plants. Now, nitrogen is generally taken from urea or ammonium nitrate. Phosphorus is generally taken from diammonium phosphate. This is also a fertilizer. And potash is generally taken from muriate of potash. So these are the 3-4 major fertilizers that are used by farmers all over the world. And their yield, their crop growth depends on the availability of these fertilizers. Farmers all over the world require these fertilizers or their crops would fail or their entire agricultural system would fail. So all countries, as far as their agricultural sector is concerned, is dependent on these 3-4 fertilizers. Okay, I'll repeat these 3-4 fertilizers again. Urea and ammonium nitrate for nitrogen, diammonium phosphate for phosphorus, and muriate of potash for potash. Okay, now here is where you'll know about India's vulnerability. The problem is that these fertilizers are absolutely necessary for our farmers. But India is not self-reliant when it comes to production of these fertilizers. India is import dependent. 30% of urea in India is imported from abroad. 90% of phosphorus fertilizers are imported from abroad. And 100%, yes, almost 100% of potash fertilizers are imported from abroad. So India is highly import dependent, okay? And now in this current geopolitical environment, this import dependency is costing India. Why? Well, as you all know that the entire West Asian region and Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the European region and the West Asian region is going through crisis. And this has impacted the supply of certain important fertilizers for India. For example, 70% of rock phosphate from which phosphate fertilizers are made, okay? 70% of rock phosphate comes from Morocco. It is part of this troubled region. 40% of potash came from Russia and Belarus. But because of Russia-Ukraine war, their supply has gotten restricted. And you might be thinking that, well, as far as urea is concerned, India is not that much import dependent. Only 30% of urea is imported from abroad. 70% of urea is made in India. So yes, we understand that as far as phosphorus is concerned, potash is concerned, we should be really worried. Okay, because we are highly import dependent and the areas from which we import these fertilizers are currently going through a lot of crisis. But urea, we should be secure because only 30% of urea is imported from abroad. Well, not so soon. Okay, there is a problem. Well, urea, 70% of urea is definitely manufactured in India and urea provides nitrogen. But for making urea, you require natural gas. And India is not that rich in natural gas. Most of this natural gas is imported from Qatar, or it used to be imported from Iran. But most of India's natural gas is imported from Qatar. And this liquefied natural gas that comes from Qatar passes through this Strait of Hormuz. So if tomorrow Iran decides to block Strait of Hormuz, well, we won't be able to manufacture urea because urea requires natural gas. In fact, 60% of the cost of manufacturing urea comes from natural gas only. So you see how troubled we are. Already because of Russia-Ukraine war, we were troubled with respect to potash fertilizers. Already because of this trouble in West Asia, we had problems with respect to supply of phosphate fertilizers. And now with this Israel-Iran war, our natural gas supplies are going to get restricted, which would definitely impact the manufacturing of urea in India. And let me tell you again, fertilizers are extremely important for Indian farmers. Extremely important. Okay? Now what would happen? If tomorrow Iran decides to block Strait of Hormuz, then what would India do? India would still buy from Qatar. But for that, India would have to search for another alternative route. And those alternative routes are available. But because the supply is going to get restricted because of blockage of Strait of Hormuz, there will be supply shortage of natural gas. And when there is supply shortage and high demand, what happens? Well, prices increase, right? So the prices of natural gas would increase, and that would definitely make the prices of urea also to increase, right? So urea is going to get expensive, phosphorus is already expensive, potash is already expensive, and they would become even more expensive after this or if this conflict prolongs. Make sense, right? So this is the problem. The major problem is not that the supply is going to completely stop. No, we will find alternative routes. The problem is that by blocking these important trade routes, supply is going to get restricted. Demand is very high in India, so prices would increase. And if the cost of fertilizer increases, well, the cost for these fertilizers is borne by the farmers. The cost of farming would increase. And when the cost of farming would increase, what would happen? Cost of or price of food would increase because fertilizers are used to make food crops, right? So food would get expensive and this would cause severe food inflation in India, right? So food inflation would be a very, very, very serious economic problem in India. Plus, there is another economic problem. You see, I told you before that India is import dependent when it comes to all these fertilizers. Now, if these fertilizers become expensive or the raw material for making these fertilizers becomes expensive, what will happen? India's import bill will increase. Now, when India's import bill increases, this widens our current account deficit. When this current account deficit gets widened, our rupee depreciates. When our rupee depreciates, then, well, imports become further expensive. And when imports become further expensive, this vicious cycle continues, right? So India will be trapped in this vicious cycle. This is the problem. And agricultural sector would be a casualty in all of this, right? Now the problems for India don't stop there. There is another problem. You see, when fertilizers become expensive, they become expensive for farmers. But Indian government wants to shield farmers from these price shocks. So what does the government do? Well, government provides subsidies to farmers. So whatever the price or international price of these fertilizers be, government will provide subsidy, huge enough subsidy, so that farmers don't have to bear the burden of this price rise. But the thing is that if the international prices of these fertilizers would increase, then Indian government's subsidy burden would increase. If Indian government's subsidy burden increases, then what will happen? Well, India's fiscal deficit would widen. If India's fiscal deficit widens, then what would happen? Well, debt on Indian government would increase, and that would create another set of problems. So if these fertilizers become expensive, they not only would widen our current account deficit or increase our import bill, they would also widen our fiscal deficit and increase debt on India. Because, well, let me tell you, last year India spent 1.8 lakh crore on subsidies alone. 70% of India's agricultural burden, okay, or 70% of India's spending on agricultural sector is spent on fertilizer subsidy only. Okay, now if this increases, government of India's burden would increase. That would mean that Indian government has to borrow. This would increase our debt massively. So the problem is going to be multifold. And again, agricultural sector would be a casualty. Clear? So these are the problems that India faces. Now, is there a solution? So yes, there is a solution, and Indian government has been working on that solution for quite some time now. Okay. Now look, this problem of fertilizers and Indian agricultural sector is the problem of supply and demand. The thing is that Indian farmers require a lot of chemical fertilizers to increase productivity and to increase production of food crops. Okay, so there is huge demand for fertilizers, chemical fertilizers. Plus, there is supply side problem also. And what is that supply side problem? The supply side problem is that India is not self-reliant when it comes to the supply of these fertilizers. India is import dependent. So for many years now, Indian government has been working on both these fronts, the demand side and the supply side. First, let's talk about demand side. Now, this problem would get solved if demand for chemical fertilizers reduces in India. Now, this demand can be reduced if farmers rely less on chemical fertilizers and rely more on other things. For example, a lot of chemical fertilizers get wasted because the usage of those chemical fertilizers by farmers is not that efficient. If farmers would use precision farming, drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation, well, these fertilizers, these chemical fertilizers would not get wasted. Only that amount would be used that is required by the soil of that farmer, right? So the demand for chemical fertilizers would get reduced. Plus, if farmers shift towards horticulture, organic farming, already chemical fertilizer usage would also get reduced. So there are a few ways through which you can reduce the demand of these chemical fertilizers, right? Now, government is trying to encourage farmers to shift to less chemical fertilizer intensive agriculture. In fact, Government of India launched a scheme called PM Pranam scheme. Under that scheme, well, central government would incentivize state governments if they take steps to promote non-chemical fertilizer farming. Okay, so if farmers are basically encouraged by state governments to use more precision agriculture, drip irrigation, use less chemical fertilizers, use more organic fertilizers, if all these steps are taken by farmers of a particular state, well, that state would be given some financial benefits. That is the main aim of PM Pranam scheme. So if PM Pranam scheme becomes successful, well, the demand side problem would get solved to a certain extent, right? So demand for chemical fertilizers would get reduced. Now, the demand side is being handled. What about the supply side? First of all, the thing is, as far as the supply side is concerned, the biggest problem is we are not self-reliant, okay? Now, this self-reliance problem is being solved through technology. Already, government has launched a particular category of fertilizers called nano fertilizers. We have launched nano urea, nano DAP, and these fertilizers, nano fertilizers, are being completely manufactured in India. So if more and more farmers are using nano urea, nano DAP, by the way, DAP is the second most consumed fertilizer in India, the most consumed being urea. So if more and more farmers use nano urea, nano DAP, well, India won't have to import these powder urea, powdered DAP, these chemical fertilizers from abroad. India will become self-reliant. And that is why Government of India is promoting the usage of nano urea over powdered urea, nano DAP over powdered DAP. Right? Makes sense? So if India becomes self-reliant because more and more farmers are choosing nano fertilizers, then definitely India will become self-reliant, right? So if India will become self-reliant when it comes to these fertilizers, simply put, India solves the supply problem. And if more and more farmers use less fertilizers, chemical fertilizers I'm talking about, then India will solve this demand side problem. Only if Indian government solves these two problems, demand side and supply side, then only we can save ourselves from this geopolitical vulnerability or from this geopolitical conflict. Because even if Israel-Iran war gets solved tomorrow, well, you never know what is in store. I mean, what is there in future? You don't know, right? Yes, Israel and Iran might stop fighting, but then tomorrow some other country would start fighting and India would be vulnerable again. Therefore, India needs to be Atmanirbhar. India needs to be self-reliant. India needs to shield itself from these geopolitical shocks. So whatever happens in the entire world, India won't be worried. And that's what the government has been trying to do. But government has been trying to do this. It takes time to completely shift to this strategy. It takes time to completely make PM Pranam scheme successful. It takes time to promote nano fertilizers in India completely. We are on that path, but we have not reached there. So in the short term, we are really vulnerable because of this Israel-Iran conflict.